Or welcome to everybody who's joining us now. So this is the tutorial on deep learning for brain encoding and decoding. And unfortunately, the organizers were not able to join in person, but we're really thankful to be able to still be able to present to you all the very interesting work in this area. And so right now we're starting the last two sessions of the tutorial. So the first one is much longer. It's on the advanced methods. And then we have just a 15-minute summary at the end about everything that we've said today, all the highlights, and also some future trends. So please stick around for that. It will be also very interesting. So in this advanced methods part, I wanted to touch on some work that has dealt with big challenges in using deep learning for actually cognitive modeling, to actually have models of different cognitive processes in the brain. So the first challenge is that these deep learning models are not necessarily specifically designed to model brain processing. So for example, a language model is designed to predict upcoming words. So of course, I'm sure the majority of you are familiar with this objective function. So the point is to predict what's going to happen, the word that's going to occur next, given the current context. So for example, when Harry never thought, we want to predict the next word, which is he, and then would, etc. And so this kind of language model is not necessarily meant to actually model how language processing happens in the brain, though we do see that representations that the model learns internally do correlate to an extent with representations from brain recordings of people processing language as well. So we do see some commonalities between the two, but in order to actually use this model to model cognitive processes in the brain, we do need to make some adjustments, because the actual objective that it's optimized for is not to model the brain. And so there's two main ways that people have tried to deal with this. The first one is to actually train this deep learning model with additional brain recordings, or even from scratch, to actually make it more towards a model of cognitive processing in the brain. And the second is to introduce some task-based modeling there. So of course, in the brain, we do different kinds of tasks, and it's important to have models that can account for this and not just use a pre-trained model that's tuned for a very specific function, like predicting the next word. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on is that, of course, we all know that deep learning models are notoriously difficult to interpret. And this is especially a problem for using these deep learning models to model cognition in the brain, because different models have different amounts of information and different sources of information in their internal representations. So for example, for this even very simple recurrence-based model, for a specific internal representation of the model, people have found that this internal representation, from it, we can decode parts of speech, a semantic role of this current word, and some dependencies on other words. So all of these types of information are in fact contained in the same vector representation of this word that we extract from the model. So then when we use this information, this vector, to predict brain recordings, what kind of takeaways, scientific takeaways, can we obtain from this, right? So we have this very rich information vector that we use as features to predict the brain response, but then we want to know exactly what type of information are we using to predict specific parts of the brain. So this will help us in really understanding having a scientific interpretation of these encoding models that we built. And this is usually done via disentangling contributions of different sources of information to brain predictions. And this is something that my group at the Max Planck Institute for Software Systems is really focused on, and we think very hard about how to use these rich representations of stimuli for naturalistic brain stimulus to disentangle these different sources and then be able to say something scientific about the relationship to the brain. And so this first thing that I wanted to mention here is how people have tried to overcome some of these challenges by training deep learning models using brain recordings directly. So in this first
Mariya, sorry for the interruption. Here actually the network is not that good. Can you turn off your video so that?
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yep. Sounds good. Right. So in this first work, which is work that I've participated in as well. Here, what we wanted to do was we wanted to optimize a state-of-the-art language model, which at the time was BERT. So this was work done in 2019 to incorporate brain recordings of people processing a chapter of Harry Potter to optimize the BERT essentially to better predict these brain recordings. And so we did this with two types of brain recordings, fMRI and MEG, which have these different levels of resolution. So fMRI has really good spatial resolution, and MEG has really good temporal resolution. So essentially, at a high level, this pipeline, which you may recognize from the previous session on encoding, is that we present a chapter of a book to a person as we scan their brain activity word by word. We also present this chapter as input to a language model, in this case BERT, and we extract these representations from different layers in the model and different places in the brain. And then we can calculate the alignment at the end using an encoding model, which is telling us how the representations, how aligned are the presentations in the model to the brain. In other words, how well can we predict the brain activity as a function of the model representations. And so this is the usual encoding model setup, but now in this work, we use error propagation to actually tune BERT to better be able to predict the brain recordings using fMRI and MEG. So here we used a very simple mean squared error objective function to actually bring the representations in the model closer to the representations in the human brain while seeing this chapter of Harry Potter. And what we found here is that this brain optimized BERT was able to predict unseen fMRI recordings much better, and especially, excuse me, especially in some canonical language regions. So these are language regions which are thought to participate in the processing of sentences more than processing of some unrelated words that somebody has read as a list, rather than participating in an actual sentence that brings together the meaning. So we do see that these brain optimized models are better able to predict these specific regions. So not all parts of the brain, even though all brain activity was used to tune the model. So this was one way to overcome this limitation. And another work that has also used brain recordings in optimizing models is this work by Katja Selinger, which was published in PLOS Computational Biology in 2021. And here the authors used, this was in the vision domain, so authors used movie and clips from TV shows, and they used brain recordings from fMRI only. And so here the setup was that they had an AlexNet architecture, so it has several different layers. In each layer they supervised with being able to be predicting brain activity in particular hierarchical areas of the brain. And they started off with some early areas like V1, which is the early visual cortex. And then each layer afterwards, they matched with a higher level in the visual hierarchy, such as V2 and V3. So what they showed here was that these brain optimized vision models that were trained entirely using fMRI recordings. So they're not fine-tuned using these recordings like the previous work that I told you about. Instead, they were optimized directly using the fMRI data. We're actually performing on par with task-optimized networks for predicting brain responses. So in other words, these brain-optimized CNN models were able to capture similar kind of brain-relevant variants as the task-optimized models that were trained on image classification, especially in early regions of interest in the brain, as well as some high-level regions of interest that are part of the visual network hierarchy. And then the last work that I wanted to mention in this whole research direction is also in the vision domain. And here they used fMRI data of people processing natural scenes. So this is part of the natural scene dataset, which is a very popular dataset, very recent dataset. And this work is from 2022. And here they also use brain-optimized convolutional neural networks that were trained entirely from scratch to predict the brain response. And what they found here is that these brain-optimized vision models, in fact, can predict as well the brain signals that correspond to some category of a stimulus. And what was really interesting in this work is that they showed that you can do this prediction for from the brain-optimized vision model for categories that were never seen and never trained on before. So this is completely zero shot here. So this was very exciting work. And actually, I will share one more work here that is also quite interesting, which is also using brain-optimized convolutional neural networks. And here, the interesting part that they wanted to investigate is this assumption of the hierarchy of processing and the mapping onto different layers onto convolutional neural networks. So once they used the brain data to actually optimize these convolutional neural networks, they showed that the brain-optimized vision models, the brain-optimized convolutional neural networks, are actually learning representations that are not strictly following this hierarchy that we see from task-optimized models. So this was also very interesting, and it was recently published a few months ago in Nature Communications journal. So it is quite impactful. The field is still trying to understand this hierarchy of information processing in both vision and in language. And so this work contributes to this debate. So this was on the training of deep learning models using brain recordings. And now I want to talk to you about actually using task-based modeling rather than some pre-trained model that is optimized for a very specific task that may not be related to the task in the brain. So here in this work, this is from a few years back, from 2013 in Nature Neuroscience. Here, what the authors did was they recorded brain activity in fMRI of people watching natural movies. So these are short clips. And they asked the people to attend to either vehicles or people. So there are two conditions in which people attended to one of those two categories. And so what they did was they built encoding models that predicted the brain response in both of those conditions separately. And then they looked at in what way are they actually predicting the brain activity in those two different conditions. And what they found, which was very interesting, was that this shifting your attention to a specific category, so vehicle or human, actually alters the representation of both the attended and the unattended categories. So the actual representation of vehicles was expanded whenever the people were attending to the vehicles, and also the representation of humans was shrunk when people were attending to the vehicles as well, and also the opposite. So when people were attending to the humans, the human representation was expanded and the vehicle representation was shrunk. So this was quite interesting, and it serves to show that the task the person is performing is really important for the actual brain response, and it does affect it. And so if you wanted to model this task-based processing in the brain, we need models that can also account for tasks. And then in some follow-up work here, we try to explain this ability of the brain to compose the task with the actual semantics of the stimulus. So here the question was, we see that attention does emphasize some task relevant information from this previous work, but really what is the mechanism for this this emphasizing of task relevant information? And so in this work, we looked at how can we model the brain response as a function of both the task and the stimulus. And so here we used a data set that had people processing concrete nouns and line drawings, and they were answering questions that were yes or no questions about these stimuli. So for example, if I show you the picture of a bear and I ask you, is it a tool? You say no. And so we have the brain recording for this person who's answering questions about different concrete nouns. And so what we found was that we looked at both the question effect and the word effect in the brain, and we show something quite interesting, which is that while the word affects a broad time in the brain, so starting from 200 milliseconds to around 600 milliseconds after the word is first perceived, which like very much aligns with the understanding of semantic processing of words, the question is only affecting the end of that processing, semantic processing. So only between 400 and 600 milliseconds. And so from this, we have evidence that only the end of semantic processing of a word is actually task dependent. And so for some other work that also shows this effect of tasks in the brain, this is a work from Nora Hollenstein and other colleagues. And here what they showed was that in a different brain imaging modality, this is with EEG, people were reading sentences, and the task that the person was performing was to search for specific relations. For example, semantic relations that refer to the job of somebody. So is somebody, let's say, an electrician? And so here they used different word embeddings to predict the brain activity in these different conditions. And what they found was that it was possible to predict whether somebody was either passively reading or performing a task with the text based on the EEG recordings. So they also found an effect of this task, and it was quite meaningful because they were able to predict this difference in the two conditions. So yet another evidence that the brain activity is affected by the task somebody is performing. And now now the next work actually tried to use different task-based modeling from some recent advances in fine-tuning of models for different tasks. And here what they looked at was people who had who were viewing natural scenes in fMRI, and they used different task-optimized convolutional neural networks for a range of tasks. So here these the dataset and these models were from the work Tasconomy, which maybe some of you have heard of. It's won the Best Paper Award at CVPR a few years ago. And the point there was that you could use models and test how well they transfer to these different kinds of tasks, such as denoising and detecting 2D edges and autoencoding as well. And you can use the transfer learning performance from one task to another task to judge the similarity between tasks. So this was the original Tasconomy work. But in this work, the authors took this is from Mariya Wang and colleagues at CMU. And in this work, the authors took the brain domain and they looked at how do the representations from these different task-optimized convolutional neural networks also align with the brain activity of people viewing these natural scenes. And so what they find is that vision tasks with this higher transferability also make similar predictions for brain responses from different regions. So essentially, they found this hierarchical organization of these representations from the tasks to also match quite nicely with the hierarchical transferability representations that was found by this original taxonomy work. And then another work, which is from Subba and Manish here and Professor Bapi Raju. So here it was a very interesting work as well, which used fMRI recordings and data from people reading and listening of different stimuli. And the point here was to understand, again, the relationship of task-optimized language models, in this case, to that is task-optimized for a range of tasks. And Manish referred to this briefly at the end of last session when he said that they have a related work to this at Interspeech this year, and it's happening currently. So I urge you to check that out as well, which is even more recent work. But this work that I'm talking about here was looking at language models instead of speech models. And so here, for example, they use features for coreference resolution and some shallow parsing features. And so here what they found was that in reading, the fMRI activity during reading was best explained by coreference resolution, named entity recognition, and some shallow syntax parsing, whereas the fMRI data during listening is best explained by different kinds of task-optimized networks, which were optimized for paraphrasing and summarization and natural language inference. And so this is very interesting work along the lines of understanding how task-optimized networks relate to brain activity of people processing language stimuli. And so one more work here that I wanted to mention that looks at task-based modeling is work from our group that was very recently presented at IJCAI. And here we wanted to understand how does changing the objective function of a language model affect its ability to predict the brain response. And specifically, we were focused on looking at how does training a model to further summarize narratives rather than just do very short-term language modeling affect the alignment with the brain. And we investigated 4 different models that were trained to summarize narratives. And what we see is that this is the ones that are shown in orange in the graph here, is that the models that are trained to summarize narratives on this BookSum dataset, which is a book summarization dataset, have a much higher significant alignment than the base language models with the brain activity of people processing language. And so this was very interesting, and we found this result specifically for times in the book where the people were processing characters, character names, and also different important narrative elements like emotion and emotion. And so we see that training language models to actually summarize narratives, which also is thought to impart more long-term contextual understanding in the model, does improve brain alignment, especially during important narrative elements like characters and emotions. So now I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how people have dealt with the second challenge that we discussed, which is the difficulty to interpret the representations from the models due to this multiple sources of information in the brain. So here in this work is also from our group, which looked at how can we disentangle the processing of individual words from the processing of the meaning of a sentence that's beyond individual words. So for example, here in this sentence, Mary finished the apple, this might evoke the representation of eating or apple core, but those are not different, those are not words that actually appear in the sentence. And so how can we build a model that can predict activity that's only related to the super word meaning, so meaning beyond the individual words, and not to the individual word meaning? Because all of these meanings are present in the brain response. So we had a very simple algorithm to remove information from individual words from the contextualized representation from language models, which was just based on doing a prediction from the individual words, a linear prediction of the individual words to the contextualized model, and then obtaining the residual of this prediction step. And then using this residual representation, we are now able to predict where in the brain can we, what regions of the brain are related to the processing of the super word meaning, which is beyond the processing of individual words. So here we used, again, one chapter of Harry Potter as stimulus, and we look at both fMRI and MEG recordings. And what we see is that with the full contextual representation, we can see that all language regions that are thought to process, that are important for language comprehension in the brain are significantly predicted by this full contextual representation, which is something that has been found several times. So we were just able to replicate these findings from previous work. And these findings are something that we discussed in the previous session on brain encoding. And now what happens once we remove the individual word meaning from this contextualized representation? Well, what we see is that now the super word meaning can only significantly predict only two language regions in this whole language network. So these are the anterior and posterior temporal lobes. And so here we see that both the left and the right hemisphere of these, the posterior and interior temporal lobes are processing super word meaning. And we also, another takeaway from this finding is that the word level information is quite important for prediction of most of these language regions. So here again, we use this very simple method to disentangle these two sources of information in predicting the brain response. Another work from Shailey Jain and some co-authors at UT Austin, which aim to disentangle different contributions to brain predictions, is this work that is from Europe, from 2020, in which they used stimulus representations from multi-scale language models, which were specifically created in order to maintain different types of timescales of language in different layers of the network. So what they showed is that utilizing these language models that explicitly represent different timescales of information can actually allow us to have to disentangle the different timescales in the brain as well via these voxel-wise encoding models, and we can estimate these preferred timescales of what different regions in the brain prefer in terms of what is the actual timescale of language that is relevant to these different language regions. In another type of work that aimed to disentangle the contributions of different sources, here this is work from Aniket Reddy and Leila Webe. And here they also looked at the chapter of Harry Potter, which is of people reading fMRI word by word, and they were interested in understanding the contribution of syntax to the actual prediction of the brain. And so here they built different models that disentangled the syntax, and actually the different models didn't disentangle the syntax, but they disentangled the syntax in a post hoc analysis, which is similar to this residual approach that I described, in which they look at how well can we predict the brain using a syntax-based representation or a pre-trained model representation. And they look at what is the difference between those different conditions. So what they find is that the syntactic structure-based features that they construct actually explain some additional variance in some language regions over some previously used metrics like complexity metrics about how complex a certain sentence is to process. And then the second finding was that they looked at different regions in the brain in the language network, and they showed that the regions that are predicted by syntactic and semantic features are quite difficult to disentangle. So there's more that we need to do in order to understand if there's different contributions of syntax and semantics to the prediction of the different brain regions. And one more work in this area is by Charlotte Cocheteau and colleagues. And here what they wanted to do was specifically disentangle this syntactic processing and also compositional processing in the brain. And so they built different kinds of models that they looked at different places in the network, and then they did post hoc analyses that are related to this residual analysis that I described, where they look at particular layers in the brain, layers in the network, and compare them to brain activity in particular regions. So what they found here was that the compositional representations that they built recruit a wider set of regions, so wider cortical network, than using only word level representations. And that also, similarly to this work from Reddy and colleagues, they found that the syntax and semantics were not very readily disentangleable in the brain with these separate modules. So this was a open question at this point in this area. This is work from ICML in 2021. And so slightly more recent work from 2022 here tried to disentangle even further the syntactic contribution. And here they looked at pre-trained language models. And specifically, they wanted to investigate not only the full representation from the internal representation from the activations of the model, but also wanted to look at the contribution of different attention heads, which are one of the working horse in these transformer-based models. So what they found was that they could decompose these language embeddings into attention heads, which actually revealed some correlations between syntactic computations and also predictions of fMRI recordings. So this was a bit more direct evidence for some relationship of these representations in the model to syntactic computation. And so one additional work in this area, which is even more recent, is that we here, this is work from Subba and from Manish and myself. And here we wanted to have a very direct evidence for the contribution of different linguistic properties to this alignment that we observe between the language models and the brain recordings. And here we are going to use a residual approach, again, as the same approach which we described in the super word meaning work, where we disentangled individual word meaning from the contextualized representation of the models. And here, what we're doing in addition to this previous work is we're adding a linguistic property, for example, the depth of a syntactic tree. And we are going to remove information related to this linguistic property from the NLP model representations. And we're going to see how does this model representation predict the brain response before and after the removal of this linguistic property. And so here I'm showing some results from removing a particular linguistic property, which was the top constituents in the syntactic tree. And here we see that before removal, this is the blue line, the ability to predict the brain across the different layers of the network is quite high in the middle layers and less high at the ends. And then after removing this linguistic property from the model representations, we see that this bump in the middle layers is gone, and that there's a significant reduction of the performance in predicting the brain activity after removing this linguistic property. But one thing that we wanted to mention here is that the prediction of the brain is still not a chance. So this orange line is not chance level, meaning that there's still remaining properties in the actual model representations that are important for predicting the brain beyond this linguistic property that we're removing. So we've done this for many linguistic properties, and we see very interesting patterns that tell us that specifically syntactic properties are the ones that contribute most to the brain alignment trend across layers of these language models. And so one last area that I wanted to share with you here is the fact that these complex stimulus representations that we have from language models, and from also nowadays we also have multimodal models that combine language, vision, and auditory, other kinds of stimulus, not just speech, but also natural sounds. And these kinds of complex stimulus representations make it really difficult to infer the effect of the stimulus on especially multiple brain areas. So for example, if we have this visual stimulus, which is a movie, so imagine you're watching a movie and we're scanning your brain activity, the brain activity in the visual areas will be very much related to the actual visual stimulus that you're perceiving, and the information in the auditory areas will be very much related to the speech and the natural sounds in the movie as well. And now, so this variance in the brain areas, so both of these brain areas that are different, so the auditory area and the visual area, are related to the variance in the stimulus in some way. We don't know what that way is. We want to model it. But now if we use a very complex representation of this movie, for example, from a multimodal transformer, we now have information in this model that relates to both the visual and the language aspects in the stimulus. And so essentially we have some variance in the stimulus representations that is a subset of this variance in the stimulus, and that is related to both areas in some ways. And so this makes it quite complex, because even if we use this joint representation to predict both of those areas, we might say that we predict them to the same degree, which we might try to say that, oh, they're processing the same information, but in fact, they're related to different variants in the stimulus. So we need to be very careful here. And even though these language models and multimodal models and very powerful neural network models allow us to have very rich representations of the stimulus, it's still very important to have additional interpretability techniques that allow us to know exactly what part of the stimulus representation is actually related to brain response. And so in some work, we created a framework to determine whether this complex stimulus affects different brain areas in a similar way. And it's quite complex, so I won't go into the details here, but essentially it allows us to say whether a particular stimulus is affecting these areas in a similar way or in a very different way, and to test whether a specific stimulus representation is capturing the similar effect or different effect, and what other kinds of information is left unexplained from these types of representations in the brain. And so just one result from this work here, we used a multimodal stimulus in the brain. So this was a movie that people were watching, and we had fMRI recordings for this movie that people were both viewing and listening to what's going on in the movie. And we used a pre-trained language model here to do these experiments. And here, again, note that we're not using a multimodal model, we're using a language model. So there's still a lot of information that's related to the visual aspects of the movie that we've left unexplained in the brain. And so if we just use a regular encoding model to predict the brain response to the movie as a function of the language model representations, then we see this plot, for example, here, where we plot the encoding model performance for different language regions in the brain. And what we see is that many of them are predicted to a similar degree, so quite well, so about a 0.75 out of 1 for the explainable variance in these regions. So we see that, for example, a lot of the superior temporal cortex and some of the angular gyrus and some of the frontal regions are explained to a similar degree. But does that mean that they respond to the same information from this very rich stimulus? So for that, we are going to use this framework that we proposed in this work to understand the different contributions of the movie stimulus to the different areas. And some interesting things that we found, for example, are that the left and the right hemisphere, this regions 2 and 3, which are the homologous left and right hemisphere regions in the auditory cortex, respond to similar properties from the stimulus, which is quite nice replication of previous work and of our understanding of the left and right hemisphere processing in the brain. We also see, interestingly, that here, this region 2 and 6, for example, there are two types of two brain regions that are part of the language network, and we see that they are mostly differently affected by this movie stimulus, which is quite interesting because, again, from these previous works that I told you about, they had a hard time disentangling what these different language regions are doing. But here what we're showing is that there is a difference between these two language regions, and it's possibly related to the multimodal processing. We do have some follow-up work showing that this region 6 is specifically important for integrating information from multiple modalities. So this is likely, it's a possible relationship to this different processing in region 2 and 6. So using this work, we were able to reveal differences in processing across these different language network regions. And so here, I just wanted to summarize again that there were these key challenges that we addressed in using deep learning for cognitive modeling, which had to do with the models not specifically being designed to model brain processing, and also to the difficulty in using these models because they have different sources of information in their representations that we then need to understand the contribution of these different sources to the brain response. And I know we have some time left now that we can use for questions before we go on to the summary and future trends. So please speak up if you have questions. I would really appreciate the questions and also the opportunity to explain anything further.
Any questions from anyone?
Okay,
Looks like the question.
Keep going.
Okay, sounds good. So I would say, since we're a little bit ahead of schedule, so Professor Bapi Raju will lead the summary and future trends. I would say, Bapi, maybe you can say whether you want to go now or you want to wait 15 minutes.
Yeah, what I suggest is maybe I don't have more than 10 or 15 minutes, but I can complete that. And then maybe among the 3 or 4 of us, we can have a small discussion to end the tutorial, perhaps. Just that is one possibility. What is your suggestion?
Sounds good.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Yeah. So I'll stop sharing now, and then you are free to share as well.
Right. Yeah.
Also, Professor Bapi, if you can turn off the video for bandwidth purposes. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure. You can see my slides, right?
Yep.
Yes. You
Yeah.
can.
Okay. So thank you for holding on till the last part of this tutorial. I'll try to summarize in a quick way what we have done this in these 4 sessions from morning 9 o'clock, and especially those who have been attending since morning. This would be a good quick summary and to see what else we can do in this area. So to summarize, is exciting times in terms of the availability of publicly accessible data sets of various stars that are available now. Actually, they have been available since last more vigorously in the last 5 years as large, rich data sets with multimodal stimulus properties recording from participants over long durations. So there are these kind of data sets. The availability of these data sets throws up some opportunities as well as challenges. So one of the main thing which is exciting for people like us is that in some sense, I think some of the sense that you can take away from whatever decoding models we have discussed in the morning and the exhaustive list of sort of works that were proposed in the last 5 to 6 years. I mean, this field is quite young in some sense, and there's a lot of new works that come out every year. That despite that, this data is ahead of theory. That one aspect that I think you can appreciate, the fact that the representations that the brain recordings show have much richer information than currently what the models can explain, or what we can infer from how models are accurate because of what kind of internal representation, what is the alignment, what properties of the stimulus representation that correspond to what aspects of brain function. All of these are still in the early stages. And so the field is quite open for theoretical and methodological innovation. And so that's a great thing for, I guess, academicians like us, right? And people who would like to explore new ideas for their research work, either as young faculty members or PhD students. This is a good mine of problems that you can work on. So largely, we have covered two major threads in this tutorial. One is encoding models that just happened in the post-lunch session, which encoding models that can be interpreted as that can be interpreted as process models, right? So these models that process models constraining brain computational theories. So this was proposed by Krieger-Scott and Douglas in 2019. So using these encoding models as an opportunity to look at what are the computation that the brain undertakes in order to process stimuli, represent stimuli, use them, and so the activations correspond to what kind of stimulus properties. The other major thread we looked at are decoding models, which serve as test for the presence of information in neural responses. What kind of information is present that can be used to reconstruct the stimulus features or reconstruct the stimulus itself, right? So, and these decoding models are quite useful for cognitive neuroscientists interested in how the meaning is represented in the brain, right, in a simpler way to understand. And these are also useful for computational linguists for looking at the cognitive plausibility of these kind of distributional models. And so how plausible are these as explanatory tools or models for understanding the cognitive computation that happen in the brain. And in general, deep learning research is helpful in uncovering patterns in brain responses. And these are building blocks in the bigger puzzle of how information is organized in the brain and how is that used to accomplish various tasks that the brains are capable of. And these theories of information organization in the brain and the development of this, apart from cognitive neuroscientists typically use empirical methods to investigate how information is organized in the brain. And what we are proposing here is that deep learning models and this whole deep learning based applications research is a powerful way of contributing to that literature on unraveling the principles of information organization in the brain. And so this is a tremendous opportunity for us with this sort of data sets being available and the research work that we are embarking on. Of course, we need to be mindful of the challenges some of these large data sets pose, that hypothesis-driven data collection that used to be the hallmark of most of the cognitive neuroscience data sets, the classical cognitive neuroscience data sets of brain function are collected with a well-stated hypothesis with controlled experiment. And as Mariya started off her presentation on encoding models, there is now new opportunity with the deep learning models and with natural stimulus settings in which participants experience these stimuli without too much of control on the properties of the stimuli. So this is while this gives us richer, more ecologically realistic data sets, they also pose the problem in terms of what behavior that is relevant to, if you ask the participant to passively read or passively listen to, what exactly is the participant doing? Are we right? Is there any control? So recent data sets where people have started to introduce some sort of task. For example, in the simplistic case, there is a one-back task that that has been introduced just to make sure that participants are attending to the stimuli that they are supposed to. So you are monitoring the stimuli. It is still a sort of a task which is not relevant to the question that we ask. This is only to make sure the participants are attending to the stimuli that are given to them. Starting from such simple tasks that are introduced while still keeping the natural data sets theme, the other tasks such as post hoc debrief that you do, or online evaluation of the stimulus properties, their confidence of their ratings, all of these are being taken in limited contexts, and those behavioral variables. And there are some, for example, data set that both Manish and Mariya talked about, where eye fixations are recorded along with EEG data, which is feasible, much more complex if you want to do this kind of thing in the functional MRI setting. But these additional behavioral variables give you an opportunity to constrain in terms of what actual processing that's going on in the brain of the participants. So hypothesis-driven data collection, some way to introduce some aspect of this into this natural data set, naturalistic data sets might be an important consideration we need to look at. The other major issue is individual variability. Is not an exception, but is the norm in neuroimaging data. The variability that can be introduced for a variety of reasons, from the fact that your brain and my brain are different in shape, size, and your experience of life experience and my life experience are different, and how we respond to a stimulus that's given to us, and what kind of distributed brain activity that a stimulus causes. These cannot be controlled in any strict way, and the individual variability is something that you need to be mindful of whenever you build models or make explanation based on the accuracies of the models that you are currently looking at. And of course, neuroimaging data is very high dimensional, more complex, and noisy as compared to classical data sets that deep learning, some of the audience who are sitting well versed with applying deep learning models for a variety of tasks, vision tasks, language tasks, the classical data sets that you use for building those models versus neuroimaging data, functional MRI data, EEG data, MEG. These are quite very high dimensional as well as very complex and noisy. And hence, that also poses challenge in building, encoding, and decoding models. Right. So to summarize specifically what happened in this tutorial, the stimulus representation schemes that Manish talked about in the morning, both vision, language, auditory, it was actually much more exhaustive in terms of its coverage, multiple modalities, textual, video, audio, all these, and multimodal stimulus representation schemes that he talked about, followed by an introduction to the real opportunity. We are talking about opportunity that researchers have in terms of the data sets that are available that vary in multiple dimensions, different kinds of tasks, passive viewing, passive reading, passive listening, to some of the task-based fMRI data in multiple recording modalities, EEG, MEG, functional MRI. They have their own characteristic variations. EEG being an MEG that have better temporal resolution, whereas fMRI has a richer spatial resolution. Right, so this and fNIRS data that's being available, cortical, optical recordings of the cortical activity function of the surface activity, cortical surface activity that can be recorded. And fNIRS is emerging as a good compromise in terms of its flexibility of recording as well as its spatial and temporal resolution. Apart from this, what we have not really emphasized, except for 1 or 2 studies, there are also recordings that are possible while participants are doing some tasks, while their electrocorticography, ECOG data that is less noisy in some sense, but more limited in its the region of interest where you can record data from. The electrodes that are implanted directly in the cortex when participants, patients undergoing special surgical routines and so on, we have an opportunity to collect this kind of data, ECOG data, and these data sets are also now currently starting to be available, and that adds to the overall data repository that a researcher can utilize. So we then talked about during the pre-lunch session, we looked at various decoding models. I talked about the universal brain decoder for word level decoding and how this could be used for some solution that we propose for multi-view and cross-view decoding. And the recent work on continuous language decoding is exciting work that's published the beginning of this year on continuous language decoding. It gives you newer opportunities for thinking of more nuanced brain-computer interfaces that are possible with these decoding solutions. Of course, functional MRI is not as flexible for using for patients with communication difficulties. Perhaps if these models, translate to more viable models for EEG, then I think we are talking about a new sort of era of decoding solutions with brain data that is possible to be recorded. So these are the decoding models that we discussed, followed by 2 sessions. One session that looked at encoding models of classical findings. Encoding models is a real nice summary of the work, early work from Tom Mitchell's group and K's group and so on, and a nice transition to how these classical findings that used classical machine learning approaches for building encoding models, and how the modern deep learning evolution and the models that are available based on deep learning, how they enable us to take this forward in a very smooth and continuous way in some sense. And so a sense of that was conveyed in this encoding session. And the last session just before this was about advanced methods as to how tuning the deep learning models using brain recordings allows us to have better encoding models and better performance, and task-based modeling and how tasks affect the representations that are learned, or disentangling contribution of different stimulus properties for different brain activities. All of that has been looked at, of course, in a more these models that we can perhaps look at some questions that come from that. It was a very good but breezy summary through various advanced models that are proposed, and most of them have the date that goes from 22 or 21. So they are very, very new and recent proposals that have been covered. Of course, these slides will be made available, but I think there is scope for a few questions in those advanced modeling, advanced methods that were discussed. And lastly, I have a couple of slides that basically propose something that we haven't discussed, but this is something that are on my mind. So we have looked at how brain, the DNS and brain could use information from multiple modalities, and the recent advance in multimodal deep learning models gives us a newer opportunity to use them to explain, to build encoding and decoding models, as well as multiple tasks. As we know, brain is a nice biological system that's multimodal, multitask, predictive. It is dynamic. Right, so all of these aspects have been explored in the recent literature, including some from our group. So the proposal is that that the use of newer multimodal foundational models might take us further in terms of understanding the brain encoding and decoding. So the other theme is my favorite theme is how far DL models of encoding decoding can explain experiments or understanding from these brain damaged patients. One example I have here is a semantic dementia. The patient who has right anterior temporal lobe damage, who has been given this task. Semantic dementia is a condition, is a neurodegenerative disorder that is characterized by profound and widespread loss of conceptual knowledge. And so, the conceptual representations are degraded, and one example is this, where this patient with this right anterior temporal lobe damage is asked, is given an animal habitat task. The patient is asked, where would you find this? And the first they give the stimulus, 3D models are shown, and the patient obviously doesn't recognize the responses. Give a frog, I don't know, and this is a 3-dimensional model of a cow. This says, oh, it's in the house, but it looks like a dog. Perhaps some of the features that coincide with, and for a duck, and so on. So there's no recognition of the stimulus that is presented, but if they are presented the label, this lexical item FROG, frog, then or cow, duck, and you see the responses are much more valid, right? Frog, where do you find this in water, on a farm, in pond, in the woods, in trees, right? So there is this kind of damage where you don't recognize the object, but you still retain the lexical item. Right, so this is an interesting damage of certain brain region. So if we have DL models that have some encoding information about this lexical item and the visual representation, do the models exhibit such degradation, right? So in the early neural network literature, people talked about optimal brain damage, right? So do we have a similar sort of opportunity here to do some sort of optimal brain damage to the deep learning model to see which kind of damage cause these characteristic sort of difficulties that are posed by semantic dementia, right? So, and we still don't know really how this sort of selective loss happens, and it informs both the kind of representation the brain makes and how this representation, this multimodal representation, and how this gets compromised under certain conditions, right? So I feel deep learning models may have an opportunity to throw more light on this kind of scenarios. Last slide is multilinguality, which is again a topic of great interest to me in general. How do multilingual participants represent information, especially people who process languages from different typologies? Right, so language typology is one that linguists often talk about. Verb-framed language versus satellite-framed language, where how is the manner of motion, path of motion, how are they encoded in the verb? Are they encoded in the verb itself or using a satellite word that assists, that is additionally used along with this verb? And when it comes to people, right, so it is in many cases what we have seen in India and other parts of Europe, 2 languages or 3 languages that you speak may fall into different language families, and they may have different typologies and how you represent. So it is, how are these simultaneously maintained in the brain? What kind of representational overlaps and specializations that require us to maintain fidelity across such different languages that you are able to process? And of course, multi-scriptal people who know languages that use different kinds of scripts, right? How are these? This is both vision and language interaction in the brain, and how do brain activations align to modern large language models that seem to perform this language translation, is some one language to the other seamlessly, effortlessly? And what do we learn in terms of what kind of representations, intermediate representations they have, that and how far that is aligned with how brains process multiple languages, right? And the other major theme in bilingual and multilingual literature is the bilingual advantage, is what cognitive neuroscience of language researchers talk about. Apparent advantage for multilingual people in terms of their executive function, superior inhibitory control, superior memory, that some of these studies have shown. And how this is interaction between language and cognition. and cognitive performance coming out of the advantages in cognitive function that are mediated by the how many languages you speak. And so how are these what are the potential representational differences in simultaneous and sequential multilinguals, people who learn languages parallelly as they grow up, or ones that learn a new language at a later stage in their life? And are these, what is the lexicon? Do they maintain different lexicon? And is there a common repository? There are many open questions. And I have a feeling that the deep learning models and the large language models have a place and role to play in this particular literature, in this bilingual, multilingual literature. I have a lot to contribute in this toward this goal. So with that, I say a big thank you to all the participants who